Hello everyone, my name's Iman. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to cover Chapter 5 for our MCAT Biology playlist, and this chapter is titled The Endocrine System. In this chapter, we're going to cover the following objectives. First, we're going to go over the mechanisms of hormone action. We're going to learn how hormones work, how they're classified based on their chemical structure, and how they interact with different types of target tissues. Next, we're going to walk through the major endocrine organs in the body and the hormones they release. This includes everything from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to the thyroid, adrenal glands, the pancreas, and more. By the end of this chapter, we're going to have a clear understanding of how the endocrine system maintains homeostasis. With that introduction, let's go ahead and get started with the first objective. Mechanisms of hormone action. The endocrine system is made of specialized organs called glands that secrete chemical messengers known as hormones. These hormones are released directly into the bloodstream, where they're going to travel to distant target tissues and then trigger specific physiological responses. Now, unlike the nervous system, which uses rapid electrical signals for short-term control, the endocrine system actually relies on chemical signals that are slower but longer lasting. Hormones, they come in different chemical forms, and that's going to affect how they function in the body. There are three main types of hormones that are classified by their chemical identities. We have peptide hormones, steroid hormones, and amino acid-derived hormones. We're going to start with peptide hormones first. Peptide hormones are made of amino acids and they can range in size. These hormones are synthesized as part of larger precursor polypeptides that are then processed and modified, typically in the Golgi apparatus, before they're packaged and secreted from the cell. Now, peptide hormones, they are water soluble. And because they are water soluble, they actually cannot pass through the hydrophobic lipid bilayer of cell membranes. Instead, they have to bind to receptors on the membrane. So they bind to receptors on the surface of the target cell membrane. With that being said, let's actually walk through the mechanism of action using a classic second messenger pathway. When a peptide hormone, let's say something like epinephrine, binds to a receptor on the outside of the cell, it doesn't enter the cell itself. Instead, it acts as a first messenger, and it's going to trigger the activation of a G protein on the inside of the membrane. This G protein is then going to activate an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. This enzyme is going to catalyze the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP, which acts as a second messenger. Once it's produced, then cyclic AMP is going to activate protein kinase A. This is an enzyme that is going to phosphorylate target proteins in the cytoplasm. This phosphorylation will alter the activity of those proteins, often by turning them on or off, and that can lead to changes in gene expression. For example, protein kinase A may phosphorylate transcription factors like CREB proteins. CREB stands for cyclic AMP response element binding protein. These then go on to modify the expression of specific genes in the nucleus. So this entire pathway is a great example of a signaling cascade where a single hormone molecule can set off a chain reaction inside the cell. Now let's summarize some key characteristics of peptide hormones, starting off with secretion. Peptide hormones are released via exocytosis from endocrine cells directly into the bloodstream. As for solubility, we said that peptide hormones are water soluble. Now, this means they travel freely through the blood without the need for carrier proteins. Receptors, they bind to receptors on the cell surface since they cannot cross the lipid membrane. And their mechanism of action is that they act as first messengers, and they trigger the production of secondary messengers, which then initiate a signaling cascade that ultimately changes cell behavior. Now, finally, let's talk about the effect and timing of peptide hormones. One of the advantages of this type of signaling is amplification. So a single hormone molecule can activate many secondary messengers, which then activate many enzymes, and that's going to result in a large and fast cellular response. This also means the onset of action is rapid, but the duration is relatively short. So this makes peptide hormones really ideal for quick, transient changes. They're also easy to turn on and off depending on the body's need. All right, now we've covered peptide hormones in detail. Let's move on to steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol, and they're primarily produced by the gonads, which include the testes and ovaries, and by the adrenal cortex. Now, unlike peptide hormones, which are water soluble, steroid hormones are actually lipid soluble. This means they can actually easily cross the cell membrane and enter the cell directly. However, because they're not soluble in water, they cannot travel freely in the bloodstream. Instead, they need to be carried by transport proteins in the blood. And while they're bound to these carrier proteins, the hormones are going to be inactive. So they have to dissociate from their carriers to become biologically active and then enter their target cells. But once they're inside the cell, steroid hormones are going to bind to intracellular receptors, which may be located in the cytoplasm or directly in the nucleus. After binding, the hormone and receptor together form a hormone receptor complex, which then moves into the nucleus if it wasn't already there. Inside the nucleus, this complex binds to specific DNA sequences and then functions as a transcription factor. So in other words, it directly alters the transcription of genes. It's going to turn on certain genes or turn off certain genes depending on the hormone and the target cell. Now, the resulting messenger RNA is then translated into proteins, and that brings about long-term cellular changes. Keeping that in mind, let's summarize the key characteristics of steroid hormones. Starting off with solubility, they are lipid soluble, so they can pass through the cell membrane with ease. But when it comes to transport, they have to be carried in the blood by protein carriers. Now, when they're bound to those carriers, they're going to be inactive. They have to dissociate in order to be able to exert their effects. Now, as for receptors, they bind to receptors inside the cell, either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. And their mechanism of action is the hormone receptor complex. That's going to bind directly to DNA, and it functions as a transcription factor, which alters gene expression. Now, because this process involves changing gene transcription and then producing new proteins, the effects of steroid hormones are slower to begin, but they are longer lasting than the effects of peptide hormones. Now, one common conformational change that occurs after the hormone binds to its receptor is called dimerization. This is when the two hormone receptor complexes go ahead and pair up. Why do the two hormone receptor complexes pair up to begin with? Well, it helps stabilize interactions with DNA, and it allows gene transcription to proceed efficiently. So once again, this process, this dimerization, is when two hormone receptor complexes go ahead and pair up, And that's going to help stabilize the interaction with DNA, and it allows gene transcription to go ahead and proceed efficiently. So overall, steroid hormones are more about long-term regulation and structural or developmental changes, whereas peptide hormones tend to control short-term adjustments. With that being said, we're going to move on to our third and final class of hormones, amino acid-derived hormones. Now, as the name suggests, these hormones are made from one or two amino acids, but with additional modifications that give them unique properties. Some of the most important hormones in this group include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and the thyroid hormones T3 and T4. Now, here's what makes amino acid-derived hormones a little bit tricky. Their binding behavior varies depending on the hormone. So for catecholamines, which include epinephrine and norepinephrine, they bind to receptors on cell surfaces, just like peptide hormones do. Thyroid hormones, on the other hand, behave more like steroid hormones. They cross the membrane and they bind to intracellular receptors where they can alter gene expression. And because of this variability, the behavior of amino acid-derived hormones is less predictable than what we see with purely peptide or steroid hormones. Now, there's another way we can classify hormones, and that's by their target tissue. So far, we've grouped hormones by chemical structure, but now let's look at whether they act directly on their target cells or indirectly by stimulating other glands. We're starting off with direct hormones. Direct hormones act on their target cells. For example, insulin is secreted by the pancreas, and it acts directly on muscle cells to promote glucose uptake. No other hormones or endocrine glands are involved in that signaling pathway. This is in contrast to tropic hormones. These act on other endocrine glands, and they trigger those glands to release their own hormones. A classic example is gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is released by the hypothalamus. This stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary, and then luteinizing hormone goes on to stimulate the gonads, which produce testosterone or estrogen. So that's a three-step hormone cascade, and it's very much characteristic of tropic hormone action. These hormones are also often secreted by the hypothalamus or anterior pituitary. And again, they play a central role in coordinating complex feedback loops in the endocrine system. So to summarize, hormones can be categorized either by their chemical structure, peptide, steroid, or amino acid derived, or they can be categorized by the type of tissue they act on, whether that's direct or tropic. With that, we've completed objective 1, and now we can move into objective 2, where we're going to discuss endocrine organs and hormones. This section really focuses on the organs that make up the endocrine system and the hormones they secrete into the bloodstream. Now, these hormones then go on to travel to distant target tissues where they coordinate a wide range of physiological processes, from metabolism and growth to stress responses and reproduction. And you can see in the diagram here that endocrine glands are distributed throughout the body. Some are located in the brain, like the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland. Others are located in the neck and torso, like the thyroid, the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, and pancreas. And then we have the gonads, the testes in males, and the ovaries in females, which are involved in sexual development and reproduction. With that overview, let's go ahead and begin with the hypothalamus. This plays a central role in regulating the entire endocrine system. The hypothalamus links the nervous system to the endocrine system by regulating the pituitary gland through the release of tropic hormones. Remember, tropic hormones are those that act on other endocrine glands to stimulate hormone release. The hypothalamus is located in the forebrain, just above the pituitary gland. it communicates directly with the anterior pituitary gland through a specialized blood vessel network called the hypophyseal portal system. This is how hormones released by the hypothalamus reach the anterior pituitary very quickly and in the right concentrations. Now, an important feature of this regulation is something called negative feedback. This means that when the levels of downstream hormones get too high, they're going to inhibit any further release from the hypothalamus to prevent overproduction. And that keeps the system in homeostasis. It keeps the system balanced. In addition, it's going to be helpful to know the different regions of the hypothalamus and what they control. One region is called the anterior hypothalamus. This is involved in sexual behavior. The ventromedial region, it serves as the center that signals when you're full and you should stop eating. And then the lateral region acts as the hunger center. It's going to trigger you to eat when you're hungry. Now that we understand broadly the role of the hypothalamus in regulating behavior and in maintaining homeostasis, let's look more closely at how it interacts with the anterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus, it secretes several different tropic hormones, each of which acts on the anterior pituitary to then stimulate the release of a specific hormone in return. So let's go through the key pairings you need to know for the MCAT. We're going to start off with the gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is released by the hypothalamus and it stimulates the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These hormones then go on to act on the gonads. Next, we have growth hormone releasing hormone. This triggers the release of growth hormone, which promotes growth in bone and muscle tissues. Then we have thyroid releasing hormone. This causes the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which then stimulates the thyroid gland. Then there is corticotropin releasing hormone or factor. It stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which acts on the adrenal cortex to promote cortisol release. Now, at this point, there's one major exception to this pattern, and that involves prolactin. Instead of being stimulated by a releasing hormone, prolactin is actually inhibited by a hormone from the hypothalamus. This hormone is called prolactin inhibiting factor, and it's better known as dopamine. As long as dopamine is being released, prolactin secretion is suppressed. But if dopamine levels drop, then prolactin is secreted. To make sense of how these hormones work together, let's take a look at this diagram that shows the portal system, which links the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. It shows how hormones released by the hypothalamus can directly reach the anterior pituitary without being diluted in the circulation. Here we have the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and here we have the posterior lobe. Now I'm going to say what everybody's thinking. This gland kind of looks like a ball sack, but that's the beauty of biology. Everything kind of looks like a ball sack if you squint just the right amount. Now let's come back to something very important, negative feedback. The endocrine system uses negative feedback loops to maintain hormonal balance. So for example, if cortisol levels in the blood became too high, that increase in cortisol is going to inhibit the further release of corticotropin releasing factor from the hypothalamus and adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. And this is going to prevent the system from overshooting, and it keeps hormone levels within a healthy range. So to recap, the hypothalamus sends tropic hormone to the anterior pituitary, which then releases hormones that act on target organs like the gonads, the thyroid, or the adrenal cortex. And throughout this process, negative feedback helps keep everything under control. Now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about how the hypothalamus interacts with the posterior pituitary gland. And this works a little bit differently. So first and foremost, it doesn't use a portal system at all. Instead, it's connected to the hypothalamus by a bundle of neurons. These neurons have their cell bodies in the hypothalamus, but they extend their axons directly into the posterior pituitary. So this means that the hormones released from the posterior pituitary are actually synthesized by neurons in the hypothalamus. And once they're synthesized, the hormones are transported down the axons and stored in the posterior pituitary, where they're going to wait until it's time for them to be secreted into the bloodstream. Now, there are two key hormones you need to know that are released by the posterior pituitary. The first is oxytocin. This hormone stimulates uterine contractions during labor, and it also promotes milk ejection during breastfeeding. It also plays a role in positive feedback loops, where the presence of a stimulus like a baby sucking on the breast, that leads to more hormone release. Then we have antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. This increases water absorption in the kidneys, and it's released when the blood is too concentrated. It acts on the collecting ducts of the kidneys, and that makes them more permeable to water. So as a result, more water is absorbed back into the bloodstream, and that creates the effect where your urine is really concentrated, and that helps conserve body water. So again, these hormones are made by the hypothalamus, but they're released by the posterior pituitary. And unlike the anterior pituitary, which makes its own hormones in response to tropic signals, the posterior pituitary simply stores and releases hormones that are made in the brain. Now that we've wrapped up our overview of the hypothalamus and how it regulates the endocrine system, let's move on to the pituitary gland, which is often called the master gland of the endocrine system. Some of this section will be a repeat of what we've already said in the section on the hypothalamus, but repetition is important, so stick with me. The pituitary gland is divided into two distinct lobes, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Each lobe functions differently, and it releases its own set of hormones that control vital physiological processes throughout the entire body. Now, we're going to begin with the anterior pituitary, which plays a role in regulating growth, reproduction, stress, and metabolism. And the anterior pituitary gland is a true endocrine organ, and that's because it synthesizes and secretes hormones. In total, it produces 7 hormones, and they're divided into 2 categories. 4 of those hormones are tropic, meaning they stimulate other endocrine glands to release hormones. And then 3 of them are direct, meaning they act directly on non-endocrine target tissues. To help you remember them, we use the mnemonic flat peg. We're going to go through each letter, what it stands for, and what that hormone does. F is for follicle stimulating hormone. This hormone plays a role in reproductive function. In females, it stimulates the growth of ovarian follicles, which eventually release eggs. In males, it stimulates the Sertoli cells in the testes, which support sperm production. L stands for luteinizing hormone. This hormone also regulates the reproductive system, but it triggers ovulation in females, and it stimulates the corpus luteum to produce progesterone. In males, it stimulates the Leydig cells of the testes to produce testosterone. A is for adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex. Its main job is to stimulate the release of glucocorticoids, especially cortisol. This is a hormone that helps the body respond to stress, to maintain glucose levels, blood glucose levels, and regulate inflammation. T is for thyroid stimulating hormone. It acts on the thyroid gland. It stimulates the production and release of T3 and T4. Those are the two major thyroid hormones that increase the body's metabolic rate. So these four are our tropic hormones. Now let's move on to our direct hormones. P is for prolactin. Its role is to promote milk production in lactating females. Now, unlike most anterior pituitary hormones, prolactin is mainly regulated by inhibition. It is constantly being suppressed by dopamine from the hypothalamus, and it's only secreted when that inhibition is lifted. E is for endorphins. These are natural painkillers. They're released in response to physical stress or pain, and they're going to act on the nervous system to reduce that perception of pain. Endorphins also contribute to the runner's high that people often get when they exercise for a long period of time. Finally, G stands for growth hormone. This is also known as somatotropin. This hormone stimulates growth in nearly all tissues, especially in bone and muscle. It also promotes the release of insulin-like growth factor from the liver. That's going to support cell division and protein synthesis. Now, growth hormone plays a very important role in childhood development. If growth hormone levels are too high before the growth plate closes, all right, it leads to a condition called gigantism, where individuals grow unusually tall. If growth hormone levels are too low during childhood, it results in dwarfism, which is characterized by being a bit short due to underdevelopment of long bones. Now, if growth hormone levels rise after the growth plates have already closed, which typically happens in adulthood, by the way, the result is acromegaly. In this condition, the bones no longer grow longer, but soft tissues in certain bones, like the jaw, hands, and feet, they thicken. And that leads to very distinct facial and skeletal features. So again, all 7 of these hormones are produced by the anterior pituitary, and they regulate everything from reproduction, metabolism, pain management, and physical growth. Next is the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormones. Instead, it stores and secretes 2 hormones that are made in the hypothalamus, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These are transported down neurons from the hypothalamus, and they are then released into the bloodstream by the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone increases water reabsorption in the kidneys, and oxytocin promotes uterine contractions during labor, and it also triggers milk ejection during breastfeeding. Now, to summarize what we've learned about the pituitary gland, you can take a look at this diagram right here. In the upper half, it illustrates how hormones like oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones are made in the hypothalamus and then released by the posterior pituitary. And in the lower chart here, this summarizes how hormones from the anterior pituitary are regulated and where their target tissues are located. So this really pulls together everything we've covered so far in the second objective. With that being said, it's now time to learn about the thyroid. The thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland. Actually, some might say if you squint a little bit, it looks like, I'm better than this. It's located at the front of the neck, and it plays a role in regulating metabolism and maintaining calcium homeostasis. The thyroid gland is controlled by thyroid-stimulating hormone that is released from the anterior pituitary gland. That in turn is stimulated by thyroid-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So you can see this typical 3-tier hormone cascade at work. The thyroid gland, it has 2 major functions. The first is to help set the basal metabolic rate, and this is primarily through the hormones T3 and T4. It also helps regulate calcium levels, blood calcium levels, through a different hormone called calcitonin. Let's start with really discussing T3 and T4 first. These hormones are synthesized by the follicular cells of the thyroid, and they are made by combining iodine with the amino acid tyrosine. Now, once they're released, T3 and T4 act on nearly every cell in the body to increase the metabolic rate. And they do this in two main ways. First, by increasing cellular respiration, which really drives energy production. And second, by increasing glucose utilization and fatty acid turnover, that's going to make more fuel available for energy. Of course, there is a feedback loop that keeps T3 and T4 levels in check. When levels of these hormones are too high, they're going to inhibit the release of both thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. So this is a classic example of negative feedback, and it makes sure that these hormone levels don't overshoot. Now let's take a quick look at what happens when thyroid levels are mismatched, when thyroid levels are either too low or too high. In hypothyroidism, there is too little T3 and T4 being produced. What this leads to is cold intolerance, some weight gain, and extreme fatigue. In children, severe hypothyroidism can cause a condition called cretinism. This involves delayed growth and mental development. In hyperthyroidism, the opposite happens. We have too much T3 and T4 being produced, and this results in heat intolerance, weight loss, restlessness, and anxiety. And this is all due to an overactive metabolic rate. Now, let's switch gears to the second hormone that's produced by the thyroid, calcitonin. Calcitonin is secreted by special C cells within the thyroid gland, also known as parafollicular cells. This hormone's job is to lower blood calcium levels, and it does this through three main mechanisms. First, it is going to increase calcium excretion by the kidneys, so more calcium is lost in your urine. Second, it's going to decrease calcium absorption in the gut. That's going to reduce the amount that enters the bloodstream from your food. And third, it increases calcium storage in bone. That's going to help move excess calcium out of the blood and into the skeletal system. So overall, the thyroid gland produces two types of hormones, T3 and T4, which regulate metabolism, and calcitonin, which helps lower blood calcium. Now we're going to cover the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are these four small glands that are located on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, and their primary role is to help regulate blood calcium levels. The parathyroid glands secrete a hormone called parathyroid hormone, and this is in response to low calcium levels in the blood. So its main role is to raise blood calcium concentrations back to normal. And it does this through three major mechanisms, which you see in this diagram. First, it stimulates bone resorption. This means it activates specialized cells that break down bone matrix and release calcium from the bone into the bloodstream. Second, it increases calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, so less calcium is lost in the urine. Finally, it activates vitamin D, specifically converting it to its active form, which in turn increases calcium absorption in the intestines. Now, this is a good moment to state even more clearly how parathyroid hormone works in direct opposition to calcitonin, which we discussed earlier as a hormone secreted by the thyroid gland. While calcitonin lowers blood calcium, parathyroid hormone raises it. And this balance between the two hormones is really important for maintaining bone health. Now, in addition to regulating calcium, parathyroid hormone also influences phosphate levels. It promotes the excretion of phosphate in the urine, which helps prevent calcium phosphate precipitation, and it maintains an appropriate calcium to phosphate ratio in the blood. And now, like many hormonal systems we've seen so far, parathyroid hormone is regulated by negative feedback. So when blood calcium levels rise above normal, the release of parathyroid hormone is suppressed. This is going to ensure that calcium levels don't climb too high, which could otherwise lead to some serious problems. With that, we're going to move into discussing the adrenal glands, starting with the adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands are located on top of each kidney, and they're divided into two major parts, the adrenal cortex on the outside and the adrenal medulla on the inside. And each part releases different types of hormones. Now, like I said, we're going to start with the adrenal cortex, which produces three major classes of steroid hormones. These are glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and cortical sex hormones. We're going to go through each one in detail, starting with glucocorticoids. This includes hormones like cortisol and cortisone, and these hormones are involved in the stress response, and they have several other important functions, like they increase blood glucose concentrations, which makes more energy available to the body. They reduce protein synthesis so that the body conserves energy, and they inhibit the immune system, which helps reduce inflammation during times of physiological stress. Now, the release of glucocorticoids, this is triggered by adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and this is secreted by the anterior pituitary. This hormone itself is regulated by corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Second, we have mineralocorticoids, the most important of which is aldosterone. Aldosterone acts on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct of the nephron in the kidneys. So it promotes sodium reabsorption, which causes water to follow. So this indirectly increases blood volume and blood pressure. Now, at the same time, aldosterone promotes potassium and hydrogen ion excretion, and that's going to help maintain electrolyte and pH balance. Now, unlike glucocorticoids, aldosterone is not primarily regulated by ACTH. Instead, it's part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. That's what's shown here, and we're going to go over this in detail. When blood pressure or blood volume is low, the kidneys are going to release renin. Renin converts angiotensinogen, which is a protein made by the liver, into angiotensin 1. Then an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, this is found in the lungs primarily, it converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 has two major effects. One, it causes vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure. And two, it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Aldosterone then promotes sodium and water retention in the kidneys, which helps restore blood pressure and volume. So the system is incredibly important for regulating fluid balance, blood pressure, and long-term cardiovascular stability. Finally, the adrenal cortex also produces cortical sex hormones. These include androgens such as testosterone and estrogen. Now, although the gonads are the primary source of sex hormones, the adrenal cortex contributes to the overall levels, especially in females, where adrenal androgens play a bigger role. With that being said, we're going to move into discussing the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is quite different from the adrenal cortex, both in terms of origin and function. Unlike the cortex, which is derived from the mesoderm, the adrenal medulla is actually derived from nervous system tissue, specifically from the neural crest. Now, because of this, the medulla acts like a modified part of the sympathetic nervous system. But instead of sending nerve impulses to target tissues, it releases hormones directly into the bloodstream. These hormones are called catecholamines, and they include epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, which is known as noradrenaline. Catecholamines play a central role in the flight or fight response, which is activated during acute stress. So let's break down what these hormones do. These hormones promote the breakdown of glycogen into glucose in the liver. This increases blood sugar and it provides a quick energy supply. They also increase the basal metabolic rate. This is the body's baseline rate of energy usage. This is going to allow cells to burn more fuel rapidly during stressful situations. They also increase heart rate and they dilate the bronchi in the lungs. This is going to improve oxygen delivery to muscles and other vital organs. Finally, they also redirect blood flow. This is going to cause vasoconstriction in non-essential areas like the digestive tract and vasodilation in skeletal muscle and heart tissue. So essentially helping oxygen and nutrients go where they're most needed. And these effects really help prepare the body to either face a threat or escape from it, hence fight or flight response. Because these hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, please note that they have systematic effects and they can act on many organs at once. Let's move on to the pancreas. Now, while the pancreas is often thought of as a digestive organ, it also plays a vital hormonal role in maintaining glucose homeostasis, meaning it helps keep blood sugar levels within a healthy range. The endocrine pancreas achieves this through a specialized cluster of cells known as the islets of Langerhans. These islets contain three main types of hormone-secreting cells: alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells. Let's begin with discussing glucagon, which is secreted by the alpha cells. Glucagon's job is to raise blood glucose levels. So it kicks in when blood sugar drops too low, such as what happens between meals or during fasting. And it does this by stimulating glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen into free glucose. It also does this by promoting gluconeogenesis, which is the process of generating new glucose molecules from non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids and fats. It also does this by encouraging lipolysis and protein catabolism, meaning it helps break down fats and proteins to support glucose production. Now, in contrast, insulin is produced by the beta cells, and it works to lower blood glucose levels. It's released when you've just eaten and your blood sugar is rising. And insulin helps by stimulating glucose uptake by cells, especially muscle tissue, and by promoting anabolic processes, including 1, glycogenesis, the storage of glucose as glycogen; 2, lipogenesis, the storage of energy as fat; and 3, protein synthesis, which is the building of proteins from amino acids. So together, insulin and glucagon work like a seesaw to maintain balance. Glucagon raises blood sugar and insulin lowers it. Now, when the balance between insulin and glucagon is disrupted, the body's ability to regulate glucose, that begins to fail, and that brings us to diabetes. Diabetes is characterized by chronic hyperglycemia, or persistently high blood glucose levels, either because the body doesn't make enough insulin or because the cells have become insensitive to it. So this means glucose accumulates in the bloodstream even though the cells are starving for energy. To make more sense of that, let's look at this figure and break it down. Now, under normal conditions after you eat, rising glucose levels are going to trigger the beta cells in your pancreas to release insulin. Insulin travels through the blood and it binds to insulin receptors on target cells, like those in muscle and fat tissue. This signal allows those cells to take in glucose and either use it or store it as glycogen or fat. So in this way, insulin keeps blood sugar levels from rising too high after you've had a meal. But in type 1 diabetes, the body's own immune system mistakenly attacks and destroys those insulin-producing beta cells of the pancreas. So with no insulin, there's no signal for cells to take up glucose. So even if there's plenty of sugar in the blood, the cells, they can't access it. And what's the result? Well, the result is that blood sugar skyrockets while the cells remain energy deprived. And this usually appears in childhood or adolescence, and it requires lifelong insulin therapy. This is in contrast to type 2 diabetes. This usually develops later in life, and it involves a different issue. That issue being insulin resistance. So here, the pancreas still makes insulin, sometimes even more than normal, but the cells, they stop responding to it. So as a result, glucose isn't efficiently absorbed, and blood sugar levels are going to remain elevated. Now, over time, the beta cells, they may become exhausted and then stop producing enough insulin altogether. Now, these two conditions, type 1 and type 2, they fall under the umbrella of diabetes, and they can cause similar symptoms due to hyperglycemia or high blood sugar. The kidneys, they try to flush out the excess glucose through urine, and this leads to frequent urination. This in turn causes polydipsia, which is excessive thirst because the body now becomes dehydrated. By the way, if glucose levels drop too low, whether that's due to excess insulin or missed meals, this is called hypoglycemia. It causes shakiness, confusion, and fatigue. That's why maintaining this hormonal balance between insulin and glucagon is so critical. Now, as a final note, I want to briefly mention somatostatin. This is a hormone that's produced by delta cells in the pancreas. It acts like a brake. It inhibits both insulin and glucagon secretion to help prevent excessive swings in blood glucose levels. Next up, we have the gonads, which serve a dual role as both reproductive organs and endocrine glands. Now, in males, the testes produce testosterone. This is a hormone that's responsible for the development of the male reproductive system and for the emergence of secondary sex characteristics like the deepening of the voice, facial hair growth, and increased muscle mass. In females, the ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone, which regulate the menstrual cycle, maintain pregnancy, and they contribute to the development of female secondary sex characteristics, such as breast development and the widening of hips. Now, although we typically think of the gonads in terms of reproduction, their hormonal output is very important for long-term physiological differences that occur between male and female bodies and disruptions in their function that can lead to reproductive and systematic effects. Moving on to the pineal gland, this small pine cone-shaped structure is kind of tucked deep within the brain, and it releases melatonin, which is a hormone that helps regulate circadian rhythm. This is the body's natural sleep-wake cycle, and it's very much influenced by light. Now, as a final note, even though we focused on all of the major glands of the endocrine system, it's still important to recognize that many other organs in the body also release hormones, even if they aren't traditionally labeled as endocrine glands. So let's walk through some honorable mentions. The stomach and intestines produce several important hormones. Gastrin stimulates the release of gastric acid to aid digestion. Secretin helps regulate pH in the small intestine by stimulating bicarbonate release from the pancreas. And CCK stimulates bile release from the gallbladder and digestive enzyme secretion from the pancreas. Then the kidneys, they produce erythropoietin, or EPO. This stimulates the bone marrow to produce more erythrocytes or red blood cells. This response is especially important when blood oxygen levels are low. The heart contributes to the atria releases ANP, which promotes excretion of salt and water in the kidneys in response to stretching of the atria. Finally, the thymus, which is the most active during childhood, it secretes thymosin, which is a hormone that's crucial for the development of T cells. This is a type of white blood cell that's involved in adaptive immunity. So with that, we conclude that endocrine signaling is not confined to just a few glands. Nearly every major system in the body is involved in hormone production or response. And with that, we've completed this chapter. I hope it helps. Good luck, happy studying, and have a beautiful, beautiful day, future doctors.